Welcome to the Roche Jones Stuff House and Garden Museum. I'm Dawn Salerno. I'm Executive Director here at the museum, and I'm very happy to be host to today's talk about Tambour. So I want to alert everyone that this session is being recorded, and this will also be posted on our YouTube channel after today, so you can enjoy it more than once. I've asked you to stay muted and cameras and mics, but we'll do questions at the end, and you can also use the Q&A button to enter questions, or the chat to enter questions, but Judy will be taking questions at the end of her talk. So I've also put into the little chat that if you'd like to make a donation to today's lecture, we welcome it. Since COVID, we're doing everything online, but it's not been as easy to take ticket fees when somebody's not walking through the door. So that's just an option for you. It's only a suggested donation, and you'll find the link in the chat for that. You will also find a link to sign up to come to the museum to see the exhibition that Judy is exhibited in. This is why she's been asked to talk. Not only is she fascinating as a person, but her work is in the show Soulful Work, curated by Blair Walker and up in exhibition now at the RJD. We've just extended the exhibition through February of 2021. We do ask that you set up an appointment to visit the museum, and that way we can keep the space safe for you and your party that you arrive with. And so this is during COVID times to make sure that we have protections in place and we can ensure distancing while you're here. So if you do come to visit, or maybe you have already, some of you, you will see in the Soulful Work show quilts, embroidery, tatting, and of course tambour, which is what we're here to learn more about today from Judy. So a little bit about Judy. Judy Lund has degrees from Wellesley College and Yale University, and a certificate in textile history and conservation. She is an independent researcher and writer with interest in whaling history and local history of the New Bedford, Massachusetts area, as well as needlework, history, and tools. While working for the New Bedford Whaling Museum for 13 years as registrar and curator, she designed and implemented changing exhibitions there. She has written a number of books and papers and is currently working on the Whaling Museum's new web venture, whalinghistory.org. So you should check that out. I will put it in the chat for you as well, and I will turn it over to Judy. And Judy, just let me know when you want to advance your slides.
I will do that. I think we need the first slide.
Right.
Oops, you're going forward much too fast. There you go. Got it. Okay, let's go. Tambour embroidery is an antique textile surface decoration technique. Most embroidery is done with a needle, but tambour embroidery is done with a hook, and that's what makes it unique. It probably originated in India or China. The origins are really quite obscure, but this picture, painting from 1820, shows some Indian embroiderers working on tambour. Now, I'm about to tell you it has to be done on a hoop because tambour is actually the French word for drum, and the textile is stretched on an embroidery hoop, essentially, or frame, because it's a two-handed technique, and therefore you need to have both hands free. These folks seem to be doing it without a frame. They're also working on what looks like a rather rigid fabric. When Vasco da Gama opened up a southern sea route to India, trade began to flourish, and the Western world learned about India and all its elegant arts. Mary Jean's probably the only one who remembers that years ago, the Whaling Museum did an exhibit of Portuguese and the East and arts, furniture, and embroideries. There was an absolutely magnificent bed covering covered with tambour embroidery, gold silk on silk, dating between 1600 and 1625. Just a beautiful piece of work. The next slide shows you what happened when tambour embroidery arrived. It became the latest thing in France and England and Portugal, those countries. And here is an absolutely beautiful example of a 19th century gentleman's waistcoat. This is where you see a lot of tambour embroidery. This embroidery was done on the silk. It was done on the fabric, and then the fabric was made into a lovely, elegant waistcoat, as you might have worn in France or England in the late 18th and early 19th century. The next slide shows Madame de Pompadour at her tambour frame. In 1763 or 4, this painting hangs in the National Gallery in London. It's huge. It's probably 6 feet tall. And I came around a corner and first saw it. There she is in full splendor with her embroidered dress, her lace over her shoulders, and she's sitting at this elegant frame with a piece of work stretched on it. A really lovely indication of how it was done and how fast it caught on in France. But not to be outdone, very soon it came to our shores. The next slide shows, first, this is British, this is not ours. This is Joshua Reynolds, 1780. Again, it was the in thing to do. These young ladies with their tambour hooks in hand, winding thread, working, dressed to the nines for sure. And by the looks of it, the lady on the right has, you can see the edges of her tambour embroidery hanging out from the frame, probably in that case being done on lace, not on solid cloth. The next one is American. Got ahead of myself. The next one is Gilbert Stuart painting. There are two versions of this painting. One calls this Miss Vick and her cousin. The other one calls it Miss Dick and her cousin. And so I haven't found the solution to that, but you can see again, a tambour hook in hand, cousin holding the pattern, and she's looking beautifully elegant in her lovely white dress. The next slide shows what you would have seen, perhaps in New Bedford at that time. Here is plainness to be absolutely personified by William Roach. His waistcoat has no decoration. It's plain brown. He looks really quite staid and still perfectly Quaker in his approach. Though, as we all know, the Quakers then went on to develop a little more interest in spending the money that they had accrued, and they built a magnificent church building not far from the Roach Jones Stuff House, joining the Unitarian Church. But it did come to New Bedford, and it wasn't too much longer before it did. Next slide shows an ad. I don't have an ad from New Bedford. I know I have seen them, but I didn't have a copy. One of the problems with this COVID is you don't have access to the libraries that you used to have. But in typical style, this school mistress is advertising. She's going to instruct young ladies in the art of tambouring and lace in the new style, which would commence the first Monday in July. She's really advertising her services, and this is the way that young ladies were educated by and large in that time, going to some mistress's school and learning not only reading, writing, orthography, arithmetic, geography, but also needlework and painting, things that every polished young lady must have. So we have here the late invented tambour. But it did come to New Bedford, and I have an ad, I've seen an ad for 1821 being offered in New Bedford in the same sort of ad in a small school run by a mistress who was teaching probably more arts than literature, because that was typical of the time. But by 1821, of course, when this ad that I have but don't have, if you will, by the time that ad was popular, Quaker influence was beginning to wane. The great upheavals in the Quaker meeting took place in 1820. And as I said, part of it was Quakers had a lot of money and they were interested in being able to spend it. And so things were changing in New Bedford. So now I'm going to show you, starting with the next slide, what to do and how to do it. These are tambour hooks, ivory, bone, and agate. These hooks are on exhibit. You can see them. The agate hooks are probably French. In fact, most of them are probably French. The one in the center is bone. Heaven knows what kind of bone it might be. The one with the, interestingly, scrimshaw on it is one that I acquired very recently from a dealer who had absolutely no idea what he was selling. And it's made of elephant ivory. The red one on top is bone or ivory, and it's dyed red. And the one on top probably came out of one of those lovely Chinese work boxes that were being imported into this country that were full of ivory and bone tools. Now, these hooks, I should have taken one apart. The hook end can be covered by unscrewing that little finial on the end and putting it over the hook and screwing it right over the hook so that you could travel with it without the hook poking anyone, because these are very fine implements. Those hooks are 6 or 7 inches long. They're not very big. And I mean, the whole tool is 6 or 7 inches long. And so that's a very fine hook. You can also do tambour with a fine crochet hook. The advantage of having these with the thumb screw, besides the fact they're all changeable, in addition to that little cap on the end where that covers the needle, the next little cap in holds extra points. So you could have several sizes, or if you happen to break one, you could replace it just by unscrewing the screw and replacing it. But when you're working through fabric, which is what you're doing in this case, it's a two-handed process, and you're working through fabric or through net. You can't see how the hook is oriented. And if you orient the hook so that you know where it is in relation to that thumb screw, when I was doing it, I usually do it with the open part of the hook right lined up with the thumb screw, because then I knew where the open part of the hook was as I proceeded to do the technique. It's a very fine thread, a very fine hook, and through the fabric. And so you're feeling where the hook is and wrapping the thread around it from underneath. It's done on a frame. The next slide shows a standing frame, which I've used This one doesn't happen to have its band on it at the moment, and it's standing in a mess in the attic, but an antique standing embroidery frame, like some of those girls were using. You can also use a square frame as Madame de Pompadour was, or these days you can buy standing frames that stand on a table, a tabletop frame, meant for embroidery. I bought one years ago that I was using for crewel embroidery. You can also just clamp an embroidery hook to the edge of the table, but you can't hold the embroidery hook with the embroidery work with your hands, because both hands are busy doing other things. Now, going back to the picture that we showed back at the beginning, the next slide features the hook. The slide features the hook. The next slide features the hook. Whoops, didn't though, did it? There's another hook. That hook is also used by Indian embroiderers, and that one is very different. That one's much more like the kind of hook you would use for rug hooking. It's held in the palm of your hand, but it would do essentially the same thing. So how do you do it? When I did this back in the early 80s, there was really no literature at all on how to do tambour embroidery. But it wasn't too long after I did this project. This tambour project was my thesis, if you will, for that 2-year program at Pine Manor. They didn't have master's degree granting programs then, but it was essentially that sort of course. And so I decided to do tambour embroidery because I couldn't find any information about it. And here you can see the hook being put through the fabric in the frame. These are all Fukuyama's diagrams, because when he finally published this book, he did all the work for me in terms of illustrating it. So you can see the hook reaches down through the fabric, and here the hook is, as I do it, oriented right toward the thumb screw so you can tell where it is. You hook the yarn around that hook, and then you pull it back up to the surface. Next slide sort of shows that process. You can see you wrap the yarn, thread, whatever, I've done it with both, around the hook, lift it up through the fabric. What you're doing is, if you're an embroiderer, you're doing chain stitch. But this is much faster. I time myself, I can probably do 6 or 7 times faster than chain stitch with a needle. In chain stitch with a needle, you go up through the fabric, you come back down, and then you go up a little farther ahead. But you hope that when you both come up and down, you go in the same hole, but you never do, or not often. And you can see in the bottom right picture here, the advantage of doing chain stitch with a hook is both the incoming and the outgoing thread, if you will, come out of the same hole. And so it's a neater looking kind of work. Next slide. Tambour embroidery can also be used for beading and for putting on sequins. Mary Jean will probably remember when we had John Burbage doing his fashion dolls exhibit. John was a designer for Priscilla of Boston, which was noted for a very long while for making the fanciest wedding gowns. And he said his hand beaters still use tambour hooks to decorate the bodices or the hems of wedding gowns. But here you can see one bead at a time, you apply them. Same policy essentially with sequins, except the sequins you're working on the surface, and the beading you're working on the wrong side of fabric. Flapper dresses from the 20s were all beaded this way. If you've seen those chiffon dresses with layers and layers of beads, I have one that's, as an example, it's falling apart because the silk chiffon has given out by the weight of the beads on that fine fabric. Now I will show you a few examples. Oops, didn't work, did it? Now I'll show you a few examples. These are a couple of pictures I took years ago when these pictures were on exhibit at the Whaling Museum. Like Madame de Pompadour, when you sit for your portrait, you show off your finest. And here, Nancy Howland Bennett is showing off her lovely lace shawl, which is clearly tambour embroidered. You can tell by the look of it. Likewise, the next slide shows Sarah Seabury, another portrait from the Whaling Museum collection, showing tambour embroidery on lace, on net. You can tell often the kinds of embroidery that, the kinds of designs that tambour embroidery clearly shows, because tambour is a continuous line design. When you do it, you keep going. You don't stop very often. You can, it just means every time you stop and start, you've got loose ends on the back. Next slide focuses on her, yeah, you can see with the arrow, you can see her very low, whoops, no, I was going back to the arrow. You can see the designs on her shawl wrapped around her, well, maybe you call it a collar or a shawl, but the sorts of designs that are there are tambour embroidered designs. The next one now we'll get to shows a shawl. And you can see, if you looked carefully at the design, say that leaf design, that you could follow it along and go up and back on those little veins and go around and continue on your way with the design, because you just keep going and going and going. That design that was on the introductory panel that I had is a design on the side of a placemat that I did years ago, but it's a continuous line design and you have to work it out how you're going at it. The next one is another shawl with a very similar design on it. This is another one that I own, but you can see again how the design could be continuous line and really quite elegant. It's also, frankly, if you want lace, a lot easier to have and to make this kind of lace than to make regular bobbin lace, fancy, really elegant, fancy lace. And so this is a slightly less expensive kind of showy lace. I also have here a lady's dress with tambour decoration. Not the best picture in the world, but again, COVID makes us do things like copy pictures out of books. And you can see down the front of this dress, a typical 1800 empire or empire waisted dress with, on a very fine muslin, the kind of muslin that probably was coming from India, and still fine muslin comes from India. But a lovely decoration down the full front and around the hem of that dress. Next one shows a pattern for the back of a dress bodice. comes from the ladies' magazine in the collection of the V&A Museum. But it shows, again, the sort of thing that you could do. And the spots you could certainly do. It just means you've got little tag ends coming and going, which if you're really fastidious, you would, well, fasten off, but probably tie a knot and clip them because it's too many to be terribly careful with. The next slide shows some patterns from Sturbridge Village. When I was working on this project, I went in search of tambour hooks, tambour equipment, tambour instruction to Sturbridge, to a number of other museums. And at Sturbridge, I hit pay dirt. And this is a pattern book made by Amelia Howard from 1818 that shows tambour designs. And you can see here very easily how these designs could be done with a continuous line. You loop around, you do the flower, you go around the petals and then move on to the next one and on to the next one and on to the next one. That really classic sorts of tambour designs. Another pattern from their collection is this hand-drawn pattern for a shawl, like the ones I showed you earlier. This one, again, has continuous lines. It's sort of a fragment. It's what they had, but a very nice indication of tambour embroidery pattern that a girl would have had if she were going to do it herself. And so tambour embroidery really was a hand technique for surface embroidery that flourished in the late 18th, early 19th century in this country. But as the next slide will show, along came great shock to the people who were doing it all by hand. The invention of a chain stitch sewing machine. And the last few little bits I will think of with you are, is it really hand tambored or is it machine done? Much of what we see today in the marketplace, I have a vest that's covered with brightly colored stuff from India, but I'm sure it's done by sewing machine, not by hand. A lot of it still is by hand, but that's the finest work. This chain stitch sewing machine would do the work for you. You can see it was powered by you. You had to crank it, so you had very good control over where the stitches were going, but you had one hand pushing the fabric and one hand cranking the machine. So if you look at a textile, and the next slide shows a textile that is a lovely piece of work. It's a piece that might have been a bed covering or a curtain. There is a piece of it on exhibit. When I bought it from a textile dealer, and it was cut. Somebody had cut it up for some other purpose, which was really sad. But this one, if you look carefully at it, in some places or on the one on the exhibit, you can see a little bit of black ink where the pattern was drawn on the cloth before it was worked. But by flipping it over in the next slide, you can tell that this one was done by hand. This is the back of the piece. And see how uneven it is? It's clearly not a rapid line moving along as a sewing machine would be, one right after the other. Each one is placed by hand and wobbles a little bit. And that's how you can tell. Here you can see down in the lower left some of the ink bleeding through the fabric because it was drawn on with a very black, very permanent ink. But you can see the details of the back and the few threads that are left that they didn't finish off. They just cut them when they were through. Draw it through like chain stitch, crocheting, and put the thread through the loop, and it's perfectly secure to do it. So maybe you might want to do it yourself, but if you don't, maybe somebody watching this picture would be interested in trying it themselves. And the next slide shows a couple of modern tambour hooks that are available in the marketplace. Now, the only one that I would really call a true tambour hook is the blue one. It's has replaceable hooks, so you can use different sizes for different size thread. The others, frankly, I would call crochet hooks, and the one with a red handle, in fact, it is a boy crochet hook with a bigger handle put on it, just a plastic handle encompassing the shaft of the crochet hook. And my last slide, if you really are energetic, is to show you you can even buy patterns today. There are a couple of pattern companies that make wonderful patterns for reproduction clothing. And this happens to be Patterns in Time. There's another one called Past Patterns. But you can see here just exactly how the pieces would work. You would stretch them out, a much bigger piece of cloth, stretch them out on a frame and do all the work. And the designs are all there. So you could do the whole thing if you were enthusiastic about it, or you can say, well, it's nice to know that you could do it yourself, but I'm not sure I'm ever going to bother to make a man's waistcoat that looks like that. And with that, Dawn said to talk about half an hour, and as usual, I talk longer than I should, so I would entertain any questions if anybody has any.